It's fine. It's fine. Just tell me when I can go live.
Yeah, right now.
Okay, waiting. There we go.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
How's it going? I'm here today for this brief update with you here, Jess. I'm Angie Rasmussen. This is Jessica Melati Rivera. I got this scarf as a gift from my colleague who invited me here to Hong Kong, which is where I am right now. So I thought I would do a nice little Deborah Birx impression for this update on the unfolding Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So far, there's not that much that we know about this. Jess, I know you made some notes. So do you want to go over like the basics of this? And then we'll just get right into it.
Can't catch a break these days. I feel like we go hours in between news about infectious disease outbreaks, but that's because they're always happening. And when you defund this type of research, it makes visibility to these types of things delayed and inconsistent. But because we're so clued in, I got some information from some colleagues who are closer to the issue than I am. This is what I've heard so far. So again, take this with a caveat that it's still early and I don't have 100% confirmation, but it seems that this outbreak might be the Bundibugyo strain and not Zaire. It's also been reported to happen in an area that has lots of mining and perhaps some instability, which is a terrible combination of variables when you're dealing with a infectious disease outbreak that requires a lot of very vigilant control measures. It seems like there were reports of suspected cases up to a week ago that were dismissed as rumors, which again, a delay of a week on something as consequential as Ebola is pretty significant. So we're dealing with a lag already in the response, it seems, on the field. And it just feels acute too because the location seems like it's close enough to areas where it could literally spill over to bordering areas like Uganda, South Sudan, and Rwanda.
Yeah, that's exactly what I have been hearing too from my contacts. So for everybody watching, there's a bunch of different species of Ebola viruses. So there's not just one Ebola virus. The Ebola virus that most of you have heard of is what used to be called Zaire Ebola virus. Now it's just called Ebola virus. There are a couple others, though, that are highly pathogenic in humans. One of them is Sudan virus, which used to be Sudan Ebola virus, which emerged around the same time as regular Ebola virus. And it has a similar mortality rate. The Bundibugyo strain that you just mentioned was responsible for a couple different outbreaks. It hasn't emerged as frequently as Zaire or Sudan. And it has actually a lower mortality rate in these outbreaks. But again, it's really hard to judge what might be going on because the numbers that we've heard so far, with almost 250 suspected cases, 65 deaths, many of those, not all of them, but many of the confirmed positive tests have been among the people who have died, suggests that this actually might have a higher mortality rate than the previous outbreaks. At the same time, though, it's very early in the outbreak, so it's really too early, I think, to make that call. There's a lot of other factors that could be playing into this, as you mentioned, Jess. This is a fairly remote area. As you mentioned, there's a lot of mining. There's also a lot of conflict in the area, and Ebola outbreaks in general in the Democratic Republic of Congo have really been hindered by the security issues and by the violence that is in parts of the country. And so you're absolutely right in that this could spill over to neighboring countries, in particular Uganda, which is where Bundibugyo first emerged. Uganda had year and a half ago, they had a reemergence of Sudan virus. So these Ebola viruses actually continued to emerge. But the one thing that really, really worries me is that lately, since the West African epidemic about 10 years ago, Ebola outbreaks of prototypic Ebola Zaire virus have been controlled with a ring vaccination strategy because there is a vaccine available for that. The vaccine, however, is not cross-protective against these other species of Ebola virus. So there is a phase 2 trial for Sudan virus vaccines. As far as I know, there is not a vaccine for Bundibugyo, even in any kind of trial situation, which means that there won't be a vaccine that's immediately available for use in controlling this, which is really bad because when these outbreaks happen, and this is what happened in West Africa, it also happened in 2018 in North Kivu province in the Democratic Republic of Congo, these outbreaks are allowed to sort of expand and go, then they will get really, really big. And if you don't have that extra element of vaccination, particularly in a very unstable area, you're going to have a much more difficult time controlling that, especially if it gets into the cities. And unfortunately, there are reports that there are cases of people fleeing the area where the outbreak has occurred, going into the capital of this particular province, which is really, really bad, especially if global health workers cannot get there. And to your point, Jess, and I'm going to let you comment on that more, this is exactly why we are in so much trouble. You don't need to worry about getting Bundibugyo virus yourself unless you're planning to go to this part of the DRC. But you do need to worry about the fact that in the past, the US would have already had people from CDC responding to this outbreak, working with WHO, and actually potentially bringing data for candidate vaccines, because the US was instrumental in developing the vaccine for Zaire Ebola virus. And it was actually trialed and approved based on a ring vaccination trial that was done in Liberia and Sierra Leone towards the end of the 2014 to 2016 epidemic. So we are in really bad shape for this outbreak. Even though it's not going to affect us, it has massive consequences for global health and stability in the region.
Yeah. So just to, again, like reinstate the fact that we are not at all sounding alarms for something that has pandemic potential. That's not what we're saying here at all. It is going to be very terrible for the people in the region who are affected, because Ebola requires, what I mentioned before, very precise targeting for control measures. And unfortunately, because of the high mortality rate, you're dealing with a lot of dead bodies. And unfortunately, you're dealing with areas that don't always have enough resources to do the proper care of those bodies, which is unfortunately a major route of transmission for a lot of people. A lot of people who end up getting Ebola are folks who are caring for the dead or handling the bodies of the dead. It requires very strict measures to avoid exposure to the virus, hermetically sealed coffins, very, very intense PPE. And that's not always readily available. And I will say again, the gutting of systems like USAID, the gutting of global health funding for things like vaccination and other public health measures makes these outbreaks so much worse. It makes our response to them delayed. It makes the impact of morbidity and mortality that much greater. And so it's really terrible that this is happening. Again, it is not something that is an imminent threat to anybody who is not in that area. And Ebola is not one of those viruses that we think could do something like COVID, because it doesn't have that type of, transmission dynamic, but it's a very serious disease. And so we'll be following this closely. And Angie, I don't know if you think that we should maybe do this again later today. If do you think we'll get more information today?
Yeah, I think we will. And we were planning to do our normal show, Taking Shots, today at 5 p.m. Eastern time. This little update is a service that we're providing just because people have a lot of questions already that the Save America movement is supporting and sponsoring. But we were already planning on doing our regular show, Taking Shots, today to talk about hantavirus, which we can still talk about a little bit. But I actually think this is now a more important issue. And we're going to be joined by our colleague and friend, biosecurity and global health expert, Saskia Popescu. So please join us later today at 5 p.m. Eastern time, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 a.m. Hong Kong time on Saturday. Yay! And we will be filling you in with any more breaking information about this. And it's literally, I have multiple Signal chats right now with people who are involved in the response, as well as people who would have been involved in the response.
Exactly.
If the U.S. was still doing this, including some prominent former health officials and things like that. So we are trying to get as much information as possible. I'm going to stick around. I know you have to bounce at the top of the hour, Jess, but I'm going to stick around and just talk briefly about some Ebola pathogenesis stuff, which is why you should not worry about this virus being airborne or causing a pandemic, because I know there's been a lot of discussion about that with hantavirus lately. Ebola can be transmitted by the aerosol route, but it cannot be transmitted person to person. And I'm going to explain why when you log off, Jess.
Yes.
But we will be covering all of the additional breaking news today at 5 p.m. on Taking Shots. So please do join us then, and we'll have a more fulsome discussion, and I'll hopefully have some more coffee before then too.
Sounds good. All right. I'll talk to you guys soon.
Okay. Thanks,
Bye.
Jess. Take care.
You too.
Okay, everybody. Now let's talk about macrophages. So Ebola virus has been transmitted experimentally to animals via the aerosol route. We also think that in some outbreaks, in certain situations, people may actually contract Ebola through the aerosol route because Ebola virus pathogenesis, and after the 2014 to 2016 outbreak, people began to really appreciate that it causes a lot of gastrointestinal disease too. So in an Ebola treatment unit, which often can be crowded in the middle of a big outbreak, it can be very hot, it can be very confined, and there is not necessarily a lot of circulating air. If people are vomiting a lot, that is creating aerosols, and people can inhale those. Just for reference, I did a study with some colleagues at the University of Texas Medical Branch a few years ago, and we did experimental infection of non-human primates with Ebola Zaire, with the West African isolate of that virus. And we actually found that you only need one infectious unit of Ebola virus to get uniform lethality in these animals. And that's what's been seen. So that's pretty terrifying because you don't actually need very much Ebola virus at all to establish an infection by the respiratory route. But here's why you should calm down a little bit about the possibility of Ebola becoming quote unquote airborne. When Ebola gets into your lungs and causes an infection, the first cells that it targets are called pulmonary macrophages. These are cells that reside in the lungs, but they're not from the lungs. They're actually white blood cells. They're called phagocytes, and that means that they basically sort of go around gobbling up antigens or foreign material that they can then present to your immune system. If those antigens are from a virus, if there is another signal that is essentially telling the cell, hey, there's a virus infection here, it will migrate out of the lungs into the bloodstream or into the nearest secondary lymphoid organ, the lymph node or the spleen. Once it's there, there's a whole bunch more macrophages. There's also a bunch of dendritic cells, and they are all highly susceptible to Ebola virus. Now, another thing that macrophages do is they secrete a lot of a chemical called cytokines. These are pro-inflammatory cytokines, so they stimulate inflammation. The problem is these cells are infected, so they're not regulating it normally. So they basically start dumping all of these pro-inflammatory cytokines into the bloodstream, which causes systemic inflammation. At the same time, the Ebola virus is replicating in those macrophages, in those secondary lymphoid organs, not in the lung anymore. It's now in the lymph nodes, and it is producing a ton of virus. So that causes what's called viremia, which means the level of virus in your blood. That causes the liver to be infected, and ultimately the vascular endothelium, the cells that line your blood vessels, get infected. What doesn't get infected productively are the cells lining your respiratory tract, so the respiratory epithelial cells. That means that even though you're susceptible to Ebola infection by the respiratory route, you're not actually, once you have Ebola, going to be exhaling a ton of Ebola virus. Now, could it change? Could there be like an Ebola variant that would be able to infect those cells? Well, maybe. I mean, I never say never when it comes to viruses. However, I think it's pretty unlikely. Ebola pathogenesis is extremely, extremely complicated. It involves all these different cell types, and sometimes it involves cells that don't even get infected. For example, when those infected macrophages go into the lymph nodes and start infecting these dendritic cells, which they're not macrophages, they're specialized antigen presenting cells that basically also take up antigen, and then they present it to T cells to activate them. Well, they cause the T cells and the B cells that are in those lymph nodes to die. The B cells and T cells don't get infected themselves, but they do die from what's called bystander apoptosis or programmed cell death. So that's pretty bad because the key cells of your adaptive immune system, the cells that will trigger a lasting memory immune response are being killed off, the other cells, your first line of defense, the macrophages, are out of control, secreting all these pro-inflammatory cytokines into your bloodstream. What that has, the effect that has on your cells is that effectively makes your blood vessels leaky. It causes all kinds of problems with regulating vascular barrier function, which is necessary to make sure that you're not bleeding out. And that is where one of the hallmark symptoms of Ebola virus disease occurs, petechial hemorrhaging, which is essentially blood leaking out between the spaces of these vascular endothelial cells. Now, it's not direct infection that actually causes those cells to get leaky and to die in some cases. It is these pro-inflammatory cytokines. In addition to that, when you have a bunch of pro-inflammatory cytokines out of control in your bloodstream, it also causes your blood to clot abnormally. And so you end up with what's called disseminated intravascular coagulation. And I can tell you from personal experience that when you see blood that looks like this, it's essentially black or dark brown, and it looks like it's made out of coffee grounds. And that's because the blood effectively has now turned into all of these little minuscule microscopic clots, and they're everywhere. The effect of that is that it basically titrates all of your clotting factors that normally circulate in your blood to protect you against injury, to help with wound healing. It causes those to be eliminated because now they're all part of these little clots. So that means your liver has to start making more of these clotting factors. And so that's what it does. But unfortunately, do you remember how I said when there's viremia, the liver gets infected? Oh, all those hepatocytes that produce those clotting factors are now starting to die, so they can't actually produce them. And this is the mechanism by which Ebola causes hemorrhagic disease. It actually causes your blood to clot too much where it's not supposed to, and then it kills the cells that make more clotting factors that would allow you to continue to have normal blood coagulation. So that is the source of the coagulopathy, or the disease in blood clotting that Ebola virus disease causes. And that's also why it's probably not going to be airborne, because Ebola is really, really good at infecting and replicating in these cells that are not in the respiratory tract and do not lead to extensive shedding. As I mentioned, there are other circumstances that can lead to aerosol transmission by inhalation. People can be very susceptible to infection that way, but it is not something that is going to cause people to be transmitting it to each other. And that's a really key point, because as Jess was mentioning earlier, people do get infected frequently with Ebola when they are handling dead bodies. And dead body cleanup and maintenance, hygiene, I guess, has been a huge issue in past Ebola outbreaks. Many people have gotten infected from just handling dead bodies. And this is kind of unusual because oftentimes, like with respiratory viruses, for example, the virus is actually going to be in the dead person's lungs. And since they're not breathing anymore, it's much less of a risk. With Ebola, people, have a lot of virus because it's circulating at very high levels in the blood, which respiratory viruses often do not do. And so essentially the body is chock full of a lot of infectious virus. And over time, of course, that virus will become less infectious since it no longer has a living host to infect. But for the time being, those bodies are covered with so much virus that it is a really common way for people to get infected with it. And if people are not aware of that, if people don't know that it's Ebola, and there are many diseases in this part of the world where early symptoms especially look a lot like Ebola. It's very difficult sometimes to distinguish Ebola from malaria, from yellow fever, from Rift Valley fever in different places where they have viruses that can cause hemorrhagic disease. So one of the issues here is that this outbreak is really, really large. And I personally could not believe it when I saw this pop up in my feed that the case numbers were this high. At the time, the first report said more than 200 suspected cases, 65 deaths. That 65 deaths number hasn't changed. The case number seems to be going up, and it does sound like there are other cases that haven't been recognized because there are unconfirmed reports of people actually fleeing the area that the outbreak is occurring in. So this is really, really bad in terms of containment, not because Ebola is going to cause a pandemic, but because Ebola is potentially going to cause a lot of destabilization, a lot of death, a lot of damage in this area. And as Jess mentioned earlier, before she had to go, it puts other countries, surrounding countries, at risk too. Countries like Rwanda, which has recently had its own outbreak of Marburg virus, which is related, South Sudan, where there has been a lot of instability. And of course, in the DRC itself, there has been a number of infectious disease outbreaks that have really been exacerbated by the security issues in the country. People are not able to get access to vaccines. People are having all kinds of problems getting access to that basic health care. In the past, the US would have been instrumental in helping to deal with some of these situations. And I know that some of my colleagues who are government employees or were government employees were deployed in these situations to these Ebola outbreaks. These are large international coordinated responses, and the US was among the leaders of those responses. We have some of the best Ebola outbreak experts in the world in the US, and now many of those people don't have jobs. On top of that, Africa CDC is a fantastic organization. There is a ton of expertise in Africa and actually in the Democratic Republic of Congo itself. That said, the best experts in the world can't really do much if they don't have access to treatments, if they don't have access to vaccines, if they can't even get to the area where the outbreak is occurring because of the security and the violence issues. So, this is a serious problem, and the U.S. not being involved is really putting a lot more people at risk. It also suggests that the next time something emerges, whether it's Ebola or whether it is something that is potentially more transmissible from human to human, if this was a novel respiratory virus, we could potentially be in a pandemic by now without even knowing that the outbreak occurred. And the U.S. Cuts to USAID, our complete abandonment of any efforts in global health, and our own cuts, our own decimation of our own public health response capacity really says very, very worrisome things about if we can't help in a situation in Africa where we have been doing this for decades, what are we going to do if this happens in the US? I don't know the answer to that. And as somebody who has been working on Ebola for the last 15 years, not in the field, I'm not in outbreak response, I work on pathogenesis. So I know what Ebola can do to you. And it worries me a lot that we have just completely abandoned this responsibility that we once saw as really a sacred trust. And so I'm just going to close up here. As I mentioned earlier, and as Jess and I mentioned, we are going to be going back live again at 5 p.m. for our normal show, Taking Shots. I am working with the Save America movement. So is Jess. I'm the science chair for the Save America movement. And the reason for that is because this, to me, is really an issue of right and wrong. And I'm an American who grew up believing that America was a force for good in the world. We have chosen not to be because our leaders have chosen that we're not going to be. I don't accept that. And I think that it's really, really important that we fight back. So please join us tonight at 5 p.m. Eastern time. I guess it'll be really early tomorrow morning for me. So I hope that I'm kind of coherent. But we're going to be filling you in with the latest that we have heard from our colleagues who are on the ground working this outbreak, or at least in contact with the colleagues that they would have worked this outbreak with in the past. So thanks for joining, everybody. Please check out the Save America movement for more information about this and all of our other initiatives within our public health and science efforts, and our efforts overall to save America. And please join us at 5 p.m. right here. We'll see you then. I probably won't be wearing the Deborah Burke scarf. See ya.